June 5, 1944, 11:47 p.m. Pointe du Hoc, Normandy coast. The wind off the English Channel carried salt and the distant rumble of waves, crashing against limestone cliffs. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich stood in the concrete belly of Widerstandsnisse 62, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee that had long gone cold. Above him, the 155mm gun emplacement pointed toward the black horizon, its barrel encased in reinforced steel and camouflage netting. The walls around him were 2 meters thick. Poured concrete, rebar, engineering that had taken 3 years, millions of Reichsmarks, and the forced labor of thousands to complete. He believed in those walls. They all did. The Atlantic Wall stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border, 2,400 miles of fortifications, bunkers, gun batteries, and obstacles. It was the most ambitious defensive project in military history. 15,000 strongpoints, 5 million mines, 500,000 beach obstacles designed to shred landing craft like paper. Hitler himself had declared it impregnable. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, had walked these very beaches and said that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea within hours of landing. Klaus had no reason to doubt them. He had seen the wall with his own eyes. He had helped pour the concrete for bunker after bunker, watched Tiger tanks roll into hidden positions, felt the weight of artillery shells that could obliterate an entire landing zone in minutes. The Führer had promised that Germany's enemies would break themselves against these defenses like waves against granite. And for years, it seemed he was right. The Allied air raids had been nothing more than pinpricks. Bombs fell. Yes, sometimes entire towns were reduced to ash, but the bunkers remained. The guns remained. The wall remained. Every morning Klaus woke in his bunk beneath 10 feet of concrete and steel, knowing that even if the entire Royal Air Force dropped every bomb in its arsenal on his position, he would walk out unscathed. He believed in German engineering. He believed in the wall. He believed in victory. What Klaus Dietrich did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that in less than 6 hours, the sky above Normandy would turn black with an armada so vast, so incomprehensibly massive, that it would rewrite the rules of modern warfare, and the Atlantic Wall, that monument to invincibility, would become a tomb. The story of the Atlantic Wall begins not in 1944, but in 1942, when the Third Reich stood at the zenith of its power. German forces had swept across Europe in a blitzkrieg that shattered nations in weeks. France had fallen in 46 days. Poland in 27. The Balkans, the Low Countries, North Africa, all had bent beneath the boot of the Wehrmacht. By the summer of 1942, the swastika flew from the Arctic to the Sahara, from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. But Hitler understood what his generals sometimes forgot. Conquest is not the same as security. Every mile of occupied territory was a mile that had to be defended. And the greatest threat lay not in the east, where the Soviets bled themselves white in desperate counterattacks, but in the west, across the English Channel, where Britain remained unbroken, and where the industrial giant of the United States was beginning to stir. On March 23, 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive 40, the formal order to construct the Atlantic Wall. The Reich would turn the entire western coastline of Europe into a fortress. Concrete and steel would replace the armies needed in the east. Wall would be a guarantee, a promise written in fortifications that no Allied army could ever set foot on. Occupied soil again. The numbers were staggering. Over 300,000 workers, many of them forced laborers and prisoners of war, toiled around the clock. They poured 17 million cubic meters of concrete. They laid 1.2 million tons of steel. They constructed bunkers that could withstand direct hits from battleship guns, pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, observation posts with rangefinders accurate to the meter. Along the beaches, they planted Rommel's asparagus wooden stakes angled to rip apart gliders. They flooded fields to create impassable marshes. They wired entire sections of coastline with explosives, and the soldiers who manned these defenses believed in them utterly. In training films, in propaganda newsreels, in the speeches of officers, the message was constant. The Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. The Allies could send 10 divisions, 20 divisions, it would not matter. They would drown in the surf. Their tanks would explode on the beach obstacles. Their planes would be shredded by flak. The wall was not merely a defensive line. It was a symbol of German superiority, of engineering prowess, of the inevitable triumph of order over chaos. Klaus Dietrich, 22 years old, a carpenter's son from Bavaria, absorbed this belief like gospel. He had been stationed at Pointe du Hoc for 18 months. He knew every bunker, every firing angle, every shell in the magazine. He had watched supply convoys arrive with fresh ammunition, new mines, additional barbed wire. The wall was not static, it was growing, strengthening, evolving. By the spring of 1944, it seemed less like a defensive line and more like a natural feature of the landscape, as permanent as the cliffs themselves. But belief, no matter how fervent, cannot stop what is already in motion. In England, across 60 miles of cold gray water, the largest invasion force in human history was assembling. Operation Overlord was not merely a military campaign. It was an industrial miracle. Over 156,000 troops would land on the first day. Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, Poles. Behind them would come 11,000 aircraft, 7,000 ships, 20,000 vehicles, 4,000 landing craft. The logistics were almost incomprehensible. 450,000 tons of ammunition, 5 million maps, 13,000 parachutes, 10,000 torpedoes. Entire artificial harbors, mulberries, were being constructed to be towed across the channel and assembled on the Normandy coast. The soldiers boarding those ships had no illusions. They had been briefed on the Atlantic Wall. They had seen reconnaissance photos of the bunkers, the gun emplacements, the beach obstacles. They knew that the first wave would suffer horrific casualties. Eisenhower himself had drafted a speech accepting responsibility for failure. A statement to be read if the invasion collapsed into catastrophe. But they also knew something the German defenders did not. The Atlantic Wall had a fatal flaw. It was designed to repel an amphibious assault, to slaughter troops as they waded ashore. It was not designed to survive what was about to happen, because before the first soldier set foot on the beach, before the first landing craft touched sand, the sky would open. June 6, 1944, 3:14. Klaus Dietrich woke to a sound he had never heard before, that it was not the whine of a single bomber, or the stuttering roar of a fighter squadron. It was a drone, deep, mechanical, endless, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the sky itself had learned to growl. He stumbled out of his bunk, still half asleep, and climbed the stairs to the observation slit. What he saw made his throat close. The horizon was black with aircraft. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, wave after wave, wing to wing, filling the sky from north to south, east to west. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, British Lancasters, American Marauders. They came in formation so tight they seemed like a single organism, a living shadow blotting out the stars. And then the bombs began to fall. First stick hit 200 meters to the south, a string of explosions that marched across the landscape like the footsteps of a giant. The second hit the cliffs, blowing limestone and earth into the air in geysers of fire. The third hit wider Stansness 61, the bunker complex to the east. And for a moment Klaus saw the entire structure silhouetted in orange light before it vanished in smoke and flame. The sound was beyond hearing. It was a physical force, a pressure wave that crushed the air and made the concrete walls shudder. Klaus pressed his hands to his ears, but it made no difference. The bombs fell in a continuous roar, thousands of them, tons upon tons of high explosive raining down on positions that had been considered invulnerable. This was not precision bombing. This was saturation. This was the deliberate obliteration of everything along a 6-mile stretch of coastline. The Americans had brought 2,395 heavy bombers to Normandy that morning, and they dropped 12,000 tons of ordnance in less than 2 hours. Entire bunker complexes ceased to exist. Gun emplacements were buried under rubble. Communication lines were severed. Ammunition depots detonated in chain reactions that lit the pre-dawn darkness like false suns. And through it all, Klaus Dietrich huddled in his bunker and realized a truth that shattered him more completely than any bomb. The Atlantic Wall was not impregnable. It was a lie. The bombing was only the beginning. At 6:30 a.m., as the smoke from the air raid still hung over the beaches like fog, the naval bombardment began. 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 100 destroyers opened fire simultaneously. The USS Texas alone fired 250 14-inch shells, each weighing 1,500 pounds, into German positions along Omaha Beach. The HM's Warspite, a veteran of World War I, pounded targets with 15-inch guns that could penetrate 6 feet of concrete. The German defenders, those who had survived the bombing, emerged from their bunkers to find a seascape transformed. The ocean itself seemed to be on fire. Shell bursts walked across the water, across the beaches, across the fortifications. The noise was apocalyptic, a sustained thunder that made thought impossible, that reduced men to animals seeking only to survive the next second. And then, through the smoke and fire, they saw the landing craft. Hundreds of them, thousands. They came in waves, churning through the surf, disgorging men who ran, crawled, died on the sand. The Germans who could still man their weapons opened fire, And for a few terrible hours, the Atlantic Wall showed its teeth. Machine guns cut down entire platoons. Artillery shells turned landing craft into floating coffins. Omaha Beach became a slaughterhouse, the water turning red, bodies piling up in the surf. But they kept coming. This was the thing the German defenders could not comprehend. No matter how many landing craft were destroyed, more appeared. No matter how many men fell, more took their place. The Americans did not retreat. They did not waver. They advanced with a mechanical inevitability, absorbing losses that would have broken any European army. And they kept advancing. By noon, the Atlantic Wall had been breached. By evening, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. The wall, that monument to invincibility, that symbol of German superiority, had been reduced to scattered strongpoints surrounded by enemies. Klaus Dietrich, still alive in his bunker at Pointe du Hoc, listened to the radio as position after position went silent. He heard the desperation in the voices of officers calling for reinforcements that would never come. He felt the explosions as American Rangers scaled the cliffs with ropes and ladders, coming for his position with flamethrowers and grenades. In his hand, he held a chocolate bar. An American Hershey bar, given to him by a guard when he was taken prisoner 2 days later. It was sweet, impossibly sweet, sweeter than anything he had tasted in years. The wrapper was intact, the foil bright, the printing clear. This was not ersatz. This was not rationed. This was the product of a nation so wealthy, so industrially powerful, that it could afford to give chocolate to its soldiers as a matter of course. He ate it slowly, and with every bite, he understood a little more. The wall had not been defeated by superior tactics or better weapons. It had been defeated by abundance. The Americans had more bombs, more shells, more planes, more ships, more men, more chocolate than Germany could ever hope to match. They had fought not with desperation, but with surplus. They had spent resources like water because they could afford to. The chocolate was a symbol. It was proof that the war had been lost long before D-Day. Lost the moment Germany chose to fight an enemy that could produce, supply, and sustain an invasion of this scale without breaking stride. The Atlantic Wall was never breached from the inside. It did not crumble due to poor construction or cowardice. It was overwhelmed, crushed beneath a weight of materiel and manpower that exceeded every calculation, every assumption, every belief that had gone into its construction. In the months that followed, as Allied armies pushed inland and the Reich collapsed, historians and strategists would dissect Operation Overlord, analyzing every decision, every casualty, every mile gained. But for the men who had manned the Atlantic Wall, the lesson was simpler and far more devastating. They had believed in invincibility. They had believed that concrete and steel could hold back the tide of history. They had been told that their cause was just, their defenses impregnable, their victory inevitable. And then the sky had darkened. Epilogue: today, the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall still stand. You can visit them along the coasts of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, silent tombs of reinforced concrete, empty gun emplacements staring out at empty seas. Tourists walk through them, take photographs, marvel at the thickness of the walls, the ingenuity of the designs. But if you stand in one of those bunkers on a quiet morning, and you listen to the wind off the channel, you can almost hear the drone of engines. You can almost see the sky turning black with wings. The Atlantic Wall was not defeated by weakness. It was defeated by strength, overwhelming, undeniable strength. It was defeated by a democracy that could mobilize its entire industrial base, that could produce aircraft and ships and weapons at a rate the fascist powers could not match. It was defeated by men who believed not in walls, but in liberation, who crossed an ocean because tyranny, no matter how well fortified, could not be allowed to stand. Klaus Dietrich survived the war. He returned to Bavaria, rebuilt his father's carpentry shop, lived to see his grandchildren. But he never forgot the morning the sky turned black. He never forgot the chocolate bar. And when asked years later what the Atlantic Wall had been like, he would shake his head and say only this: we thought walls could save us. But walls are only as strong as the world that builds them. And our world was already broken. The Atlantic Wall had been unbreakable until it wasn't. Until men who believed in something greater than fortifications came over the horizon, darkened the sky, and proved that freedom, no matter how costly, would always find a way through.